A mall security guard kicked out a black man for loitering, unaware that the man was one of the building's key investors. What started as a blatant act of racial bias quickly spiraled into a viral controversy, exposing deep-seated issues of prejudice and power. Careers were shattered, lives intertwined, and the guard's world was forever changed when the truth came to light. What happened next will shock even the most seasoned observers. But let's start from the beginning. It was a typical bustling afternoon at River Falls Mall, the kind of day where the air buzzed with the hum of shoppers, the smell of cinnamon pretzels wafting through the food court. Security guard James Harris made his usual rounds, his sharp eyes scanning for anything out of the ordinary. Known among the staff for his strict demeanor and no-nonsense attitude, James took pride in maintaining the mall's orderly image. As he patrolled the perimeter of the food court, his gaze landed on a black man sitting alone at a corner table. The man was dressed neatly in a dark blazer, sipping coffee from a disposable cup. But it wasn't his attire that caught James' attention. It was the bold red MAGA cap perched on his head, its white letters gleaming under the fluorescent lights. James's jaw tightened. To him, the hat wasn't just an accessory, it was a provocation. Straightening his shoulders, James strode over with purpose, weaving through the tables and families enjoying their meals. He stopped directly in front of the man, who glanced up casually. "Excuse me, sir," James said, his tone firm. "You can't just sit here loitering. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The man raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but slightly puzzled. "Loitering?" he echoed, setting his coffee cup down. "I'm not loitering. I'm just having my coffee." James wasn't convinced. His arms crossed defensively over his chest as he leaned in. "This is private property. If you don't have a reason to be here, you need to go. We don't want any trouble." The man's composure didn't waver. He tilted his head, locking eyes with James. "Trouble?" he repeated, his tone measured. "I'm just sitting here. What exactly have I done to deserve this?" James's grip on control tightened. He didn't like the way the man questioned him, didn't like how his steady gaze made him feel like the one under scrutiny. "I don't have to explain myself," James snapped. "Either leave now, or I'll call the police." A tense silence settled between them, the buzz of the food court fading into background noise. The man's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied James. Then, with deliberate calm, he leaned back in his chair. Unbeknownst to James, the man in the red MAGA cap wasn't just another mall patron. He was someone whose presence in that very mall carried weight and authority James could never have anticipated. The tense exchange between James Harris and the man in the MAGA cap had begun to attract attention. Nearby shoppers slowed their steps, their curiosity piqued. Some took out their phones, recording the scene as subtle whispers rippled through the crowd. A few exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from concern to intrigue. The hum of the food court grew quieter as the confrontation took center stage. The man, calm and composed, slowly pushed back his chair and rose to his full height. Though he didn't raise his voice, his presence commanded attention. "I'd like to speak to your manager," he said firmly, his tone carrying authority. James, unfazed, folded his arms tightly across his chest. He let out a short, dismissive laugh. "I am the one in charge here," he retorted, his voice dripping with defiance, "and I'm asking you to leave." Before the man could respond, a young mall employee in a crisp uniform hesitated nearby, shifting nervously on her feet. She glanced at the growing crowd and leaned in toward James, her voice low. James," she whispered urgently, "I think you might want to check with Mr. Larson before this goes any further." James shot her an irritated look and waved her off. "There's no need for that," he snapped. "I've got this under control." The man watched the exchange with quiet amusement, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. His expression remained unreadable, but his calm demeanor only seemed to unnerve James further. "Are you sure?" the man asked, his voice steady. "That you know who I am?" James rolled his eyes dramatically. "Look, I don't care who you are," he said, his voice rising with frustration. "You can't just waltz in here like you own the place." The man's smile widened slightly. He chuckled softly, the sound calm yet pointed. "You might want to rethink that statement," he said. For a moment, James hesitated, the man's words lingering in the air like a challenge. Around them, the crowd buzzed with speculation, and a few murmurs of recognition began to ripple through the onlookers. But James, still convinced of his authority, remained oblivious to the significance of the man standing before him, a man whose true role in the mall was far greater than James could have imagined. The crowd around the food court had grown, with onlookers craning their necks to see the escalating situation. Phones were still raised, recording every moment. The tension thickened as James Harris stood firm, convinced he was handling a routine case of loitering. Minutes later, the crowd parted as a sharply dressed older man strode into view, his polished shoes clicking briskly against the tile floor. Tom Larson, the mall's general manager, was a man known for his composure, but today his usually calm demeanor was nowhere to be seen. His face paled the instant his eyes fell on the man in the red MAGA cap. "Mr. Bradley," Larson exclaimed, his voice an uneasy mix of surprise and dread. He quickened his pace, coming to a halt just feet away. "I had no idea you were here today." James blinked, his frown deepening in confusion. "You know this guy?" he asked, his tone still defensive. Larson turned to James, looking as though he'd just been handed a live grenade. His voice dropped, trembling slightly. "This," he said carefully, "is Mr. Henry Bradley. He's one of the primary investors in this mall." The words hit James like a physical blow. His jaw slackened, and the confident stance he'd held moments earlier faltered. "Wait. What?" he stammered, his voice barely audible. Henry Bradley, still holding his coffee, arched an eyebrow. The calm yet commanding presence he had displayed throughout the confrontation now took on a sharper edge. "Yes, that's right," he said, his voice steady but laced with unmistakable authority. "I'm not just here to enjoy a latte. I helped fund this place. And this," he gestured slightly to James, "is how you treat me?" James's face flushed with humiliation. The color drained from his cheeks, replaced by a sheen of sweat as realization sunk in. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Larson, desperate to smooth things over, launched into an apology. "Mr. Bradley, I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding. This is absolutely unacceptable, and I assure you—" Bradley raised a hand, silencing Larson mid-sentence. "No need for apologies from you, Tom," he said firmly. His gaze shifted back to James, who now stood frozen, shoulders slumped. "But I think your security staff could use some serious training." The crowd, sensing the shift in power dynamics, murmured in hushed tones. The tension in the air was electric as James stood exposed, grappling with the weight of his mistake under the unyielding gaze of Henry Bradley. The morning after the incident, River Falls Mall's boardroom was thick with tension. James Harris sat stiffly in a chair, his palms sweating as he avoided eye contact with anyone else in the room. Across from him sat Tom Larson, the mall's general manager, looking grim, and Henry Bradley, whose calm demeanor only added to James's anxiety. The events of the previous day had not just stayed within the mall. They had erupted across social media, with videos of the confrontation shared widely. Comments flooded in, condemning the apparent racial profiling and expressing disbelief at James's actions. Bradley, impeccably dressed and composed, leaned forward in his chair. "I'll be honest with you," he began, his voice steady but firm. "I could fire you on the spot for what happened yesterday. No one would question that decision." James swallowed hard, his face burning with humiliation. He shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, unsure of how to respond. "But instead," Bradley continued, "I want you to think about why you made the assumptions you did. Why did you see me and decide I didn't belong? Why did you think you had the authority to treat me as though I was a problem?" James stammered, his voice trembling. I didn't mean any harm. I was just doing my job, keeping the mall safe." "No," Bradley said sharply, his voice cutting through the room. "What you did caused harm. Intent isn't the issue here. Impact is. And the impact of your actions goes far beyond embarrassing yourself. It's about the message you sent to everyone who saw that video." The weight of Bradley's words settled heavily on James's shoulders. He nodded slightly, unable to meet Bradley's gaze. The mall issued a formal apology later that day, acknowledging the incident and committing to fostering a more inclusive environment. James was temporarily suspended and required to attend sensitivity and unconscious bias training. Meanwhile, Bradley used the opportunity to spearhead a new initiative focused on employee education about racial bias, ensuring all staff received training to prevent similar incidents. In the weeks that followed, James began to confront the deeper issues behind his actions. The training sessions forced him to reflect on his own prejudices, and as he gained new insights, he reached out to Bradley with a personal apology. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Bradley said when they met, his tone firm but encouraging. "But owning up to your mistakes is a good place to start." The incident became a turning point for them all. Conversations about race, assumptions, and inclusivity began to take root, shaping a new culture that aimed to be welcoming to everyone. For James, it marked the beginning of a journey to become not just a better employee, but a better person.